Thank you very much, Jim. That's insightful. I mean, this is a feel for China and how the Chinese think and how China works. You have a feel for it. It's obviously a complex country, you know, and I've had a number of conversations with Jim about China. He's very optimistic, and at the minimum, I think we can say China is resilient. I mean, at minimum, we have to say that because, you know, every so often you have these articles and books about China's coming collapse. I remember from 2001, China's coming collapse by Gordon Chang. And then some years later, he said, well, collapse is still coming. You got the year wrong. But, you know, so and then you have more recently, David Shambo, and he came out and said, China's always going to collapse. So I listened to this and I talked to Jim. He said, oh, China's going to be fine, you know. And when I listen to Jim, I do a lot of listening because I'm not an expert enough on China to cast an assessment, final assessment. But here's a case that so far, benevolent and enlightened. Maybe you can have a cake and eat it too, so far anyway. Let me move now to Kun Kawi. Kun Kawi, can you help us? Kun Kawi is a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand and also a leading speaker, commentator, writer on regional affairs, on China in the region. But Pikawi, can you help us limit it to 12 minutes or so, and then we can have some audience participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would rather listen to Jim because I learned a lot about his views about China. I have 3 points to say, maybe in 3 minutes. But before, I would like to ask you one question, all we discussed today. Those who think China is a developed country, please raise your hand. 1, 2, okay. Those of you who think that China is a developing country, raise your hand. Probably the rest. Now, the difference between developed country and developing country is this. Developed country make rules. United States make rules. This is why you don't hear much about China making rules, because China is neither here nor there. It's in the middle. That's one question because it's linked to my first point. It's like China is introducing Sichuan menu to a hamburger restaurant. I hope it will not become, listen carefully, in America, Chinese food become chow mein or egg foo yoke, that it turned into American taste. We, Southeast Asia, prefer Sichuan Chinese food with all the spice, including the Chinese way of doing things. Now, that's my first point. What I try to say is this. I agree with Mark, I agree with James and all the views that has been expressed about AIIB. I think China will learn and has a long learning curve. And AIIB is China idea, is Asian bank, it's something, it's just 1 year old, you know, give it a time to learn. I agree with Jim that we lack the understanding of the thinking of China, and we probably end up misleading by all the communications coming from China. I mean, China is heavy burdened by its long thousands of unbroken civilization and history. To explain the Chinese to outside world is extremely difficult. Even Thailand, you know, with its own much shorter history, still have a problem in explaining itself. So this is my first point. The reason United States, I agree with you, as smoke screen. Japan actually would like to join, but Japan has problem. Japan does not have the kind of money. Can you imagine Japan join and contribute as number 10, 11? Mark did not mention, after Turkey, Thailand was the other one. Thailand invests a lot. We are the 12th largest contributor, so you have to give Thailand credit. I didn't say after Turkey, it should be Thailand. And my second point is this. Thailand embraced AIIB. Not because it's China, not because it's ADB, it's because it's something that will fulfill our domestic need. we have 20 infrastructure projects. Thailand wants to develop itself as a hub of ASEAN, of logistics, of everything, you know. So this is very important, and Thailand expect. Well, we've been through a lot with World Bank, ADB, now with AIIB, we expect something very, what do you call, Sichuan, you know, hot, spicy, the way we like. That is mean I cannot say it will be lack good governance or rule-based, because ASEAN also is a rule-based. And that is very important because AIIB provide an additional source of funding for Thailand for the next 20 years. We will have plenty of projects. But the reason why I mentioned Thailand, because Thailand also reflect the idea of ASEAN. Nobody mentioned that ASEAN also has its own connectivity, the so-called master plan of ASEAN connectivity 2025. That would require totally 885 billion in the next 15 years. So that's a lot of money, and ASEAN is expecting to have some extra funding beyond the so-called traditional funder that all of us have been mentioned. But there is one problem here. ASEAN think that China learned the connectivity from ASEAN. ASEAN came out with the full project on impact in the year 2010. And after 5 years, a new, better version came out. Just less than 2 months ago, September 7, it was adopted by the ASEAN leader, the Impact 2025, which I will call ASEAN Dream, because China Dream, 中国梦, is also linked to 东盟梦 in the sense that we have our own connectivity. But unfortunately, I think this is one of the China's shortcomings. China has not yet linked Belt and Road Initiative with impact. It's still separated. Only bilaterally, Cambodia can say anything it wants, but as long as ASEAN in its official document has not yet recognized BRI and form a committee to synergize, that is the real issue. So you can still see that as an organization, ASEAN has not yet endorsed BRI. In the statement of the China and ASEAN commemoration of the 25th anniversary, ASEAN only take, I repeat, note of BRI. And that is very unfortunate because that should be the heart of cooperation. So far, there's no connectedness yet, but it will take some time. I think the panelists mentioned one point that is very clear. There's still lingering doubt what really China wants because of other non-economics matter. For example, the situation in South China Sea, which already has created a lot of anxiety, and the residues of this anxiety already cause a lot of China, a lot of delay. Maybe you don't know, there are over 130 projects since Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang came to power offered to ASEAN, but ASEAN have not yet taken up, including the so-called 2+5 framework, which Li Keqiang tried to promote. And ASEAN, again, ASEAN is a rather strange monster. Never say things, you know, they really, in a way, sometimes they say things that they really mean it, in the sense that ASEAN still take note of Li Keqiang offer. All this note is very important. It's just show you that ASEAN has not yet really fit into all this China, including AIIB. So that is why individual approach to China still matter. Thailand, Indonesia already, as Mark has said, already got the loans, and Myanmar, and of course for the case of Thailand, I think soon it will come, but Thailand is much more complicated because the way Thailand think is much more strategic. It has to do the several somersault between major power, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Americans, not to mention the Russians. So you have all these somersault to do. So Thailand has to look in also inward into its own domestic, the currency rate and domestic liquidities and all these things come to mind. So having all said that, this is China's way to say, hello, I'm here. And if China succeed, and it will take time, like Tim said, it will be able to drive the regional order, whether it will be new, whether it will be supplementally, that will be the so-called Sinic-centric or China-centric, we don't know. But what we know exactly is that change is coming. And to understand this change, it's good to understand Chinese culture and their ways of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Khun Kavi. That complements the previous remarks by Jim and Joe Horn and the others, our speaker, our presenter, and Louis. I'm keen to involve the audience now. We can see that one point that we shouldn't overlook too now is that the regional landscape is very fluid. So if you write an article about China and the region today, try to get published, by the time it comes out, it might be something else. I mean, the Philippines, so much has changed with the Philippines' position vis-a-vis China in a matter of weeks compared to previous years. So what Khun Kavi said about ASEAN's lack of action, we may now see a shift. I mean, the Philippines, Duterte might be the game changer for Southeast Asia-China relations. Floor is opened.
Yeah, I'm Arwan Mark of the Nikkei Asian Review. Just a question to either James or Joe, because you seem to have insights on the way Chinese do business. If we look at the way Chinese projects have been signed up in Asian countries, they're comfortable dealing with governments. They seem to be at home dealing with governments, but when governments change because of democracy, because of reform, they're completely caught flat-footed, like we saw in Myanmar with the Midson Dam. I come from Sri Lanka, where government that the Chinese propped up with a lot of money was voted out last year because of its autocratic nature, and a lot of projects were frozen. And if you listen to Chinese diplomats, this creates some anger and animosity and confusion, and they go back to arguing that, well, you should stick to contracts, which is fine. So are they realizing that they need to go out and deal with, say, civil society or a broader society when pushing through projects, or they simply stick to just working with governments and be very transactional? Thanks.
I think, yes, the Chinese are masters at learning. They're sponges. And they're not ideological, which is strange for a communist party. But David Shambao, whom was alluded to by Ajahn Titinan a few minutes ago, he wrote an outstanding book in 2009 about the Chinese Communist Party. And the main point in it was they make mistakes, they then study them intensely for a long time and figure out what are the lessons from them. They also study intensely the mistakes made by other countries in the world and how to avoid those. So there's no ideological commitment. Whatever works, in the famous words of Deng Xiaoping, I don't care whether the cat is white or black so long as it catches mice. And if we're not catching mice, then we better stop and think, how should we change to do that? So I think you can see in foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy evolving over the last few years as they learn from mistakes that they've been making.
I think to add to that point, one element that actually puts a brake on this learning process is the distance from the center of the people who make the mistakes. You'll have a local, say, a construction company boss in, I don't know, Bangladesh, say. He is so far removed from any organ which is doing any learning that there might be some noise on the way. Things go wrong. Why? Oh, the partner screwed us. Why did you not do it the other way? Oh, because another guy did something wrong. The people they're sending out to run these massive multi-billion projects often haven't left China, don't have the best kind of EQ skills when it comes to dealing with foreigners, don't speak the language, and therefore the message does get distorted on the way up. So they are learning, but they're learning slower than they should be.
Thank you. From cursory experience that we have dealing with Chinese academics, journalists, diplomats, all countries have their own ways of doing things. But for the China way, China has a big way of doing the China way, a big way of doing the China things. So not quite synchronized with the non-China world. But I think the question is, how long do they get? After 20 years, if they haven't converged, then they've got the China world and the rest of the world.
Let me just add one thing. Of course, what Joe said is quite correct, but I just relate an anecdote following on Joe's mention that the Chinese still have a lot to learn about how to deal with other countries. About a year ago, I sat down with the chairman of the supervisory board of one of the top 3 state banks, and I said to him, "You're engaged in expanding overseas. You don't have the people that know how to do it. You don't have the knowledge of the countries you're going into, et cetera, et cetera." And he said, "Absolutely. That's why we're doing it very slowly. We have to build up the skill sets. We have to build up the local knowledge." And that bank actually has brought the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands onto their board of directors to help to teach them about how to handle themselves with central banks and ministries of finance in Europe.
Mark, can you maybe comment on the projects approved? James sort of hinted at it, that they were all seem to be countries that China was very close to, but you don't, other than Indonesia, you don't see Laos and Cambodia there, or at least maybe I missed them. Is there any method to the way the bank seems to be going about choosing its projects, and why isn't Laos there? You've got this railway that everybody's been talking about. What's happened? Why has ASEAN been a bit slow on this one?
Simple answer is I don't know. The way projects have been approved has been there's not been a lot of transparency, and there's been very limited release of information prior to approval. So to begin with, we found out about projects just because a lot of us are checking the website quite regularly, and then all of a sudden there was a project tab on their website that had a list of projects with very basic documentation. I think it was already mentioned that the bank started with some fairly safe projects. So there's a hydropower project. Hydropower in the region can be a very sensitive issue, but they've got involved in an old hydropower project. So it's expanding and making an existing project more efficient. Then the energy sector projects are improving transmission. So again, increasing efficiency of existing project. And most of the projects are co-financed. So I think they've selected projects that have already been studied, and they've gone through various stages of approval at IFC or World Bank and various other institutions. When it comes to Cambodia, there's a complex situation, and the World Bank froze its funding because of problems around one of its projects in Phnom Penh. So it makes it very difficult to engage on a co-finance project when the World Bank is only just coming back in, and the IFC has got problems with some projects in Cambodia. I don't know Laos as well, but basically it seems they've chosen projects that were already well studied, already well advanced in design, and relatively safe. They don't want to rush into a very high risk, sensitive project.
As Mark mentioned, we only get to know because through their website. And now, it used to be they only had what they call AIIB investments. But now they even included already projects that have been approved and in the pipeline. So they categorize them now. Before, you don't see any of this. So we check on them regularly. And as Mark has mentioned as well, most of these projects are already sort of pre-studied. So a co-financing arrangement is done. So it's the way we've been mentioning, it's really risk-free. We don't want to risk a lot. And the policies that are applied is based on co-financing. The major contributor will, its policies will be applied. So if it's a World Bank, so the country safeguards or the safeguards systems will be applied. If it's an ADB, then it's the ADB's systems that will be applied also.
How long does it take for China to go through that reform where they come out of their secretive shell and be more, because now that AIIB is more in the picture and we've got the OBOR as well, to cultivate somebody like Jack Ma. I mean, he's very outspoken, he's met prime ministers, presidents and all that. So to have somebody come out to have somebody like Jack Ma, who's outspoken, and he's not very secretive, he's actually a pioneer in motivating, you know, people across the world. So he's one good example that I see that is not very secretive and living in the shell.
How long? Maybe about 2,000 years. But let me qualify that. There are two issues. The first one is, you know, Jack Ma is not a Politburo member. He's on a, you know, maybe he's a Communist Party member. I don't know. He's not China Inc. And he's not part of the government, and he's not part of the party, you know, kind of leadership. And so he can, of course, he can say whatever he likes. And you know, companies that have the need to be transparent because they are listed will be transparent as much as they can, and as much as they have to. But I think there is, why I said 2,000 years is because there is it's a cultural thing about trying not to be as transparent as you can if you can get away with it. And that cultural thing takes millennia to erode, and you know, and honestly, transparency is not necessarily viewed as a virtue. It's not something you necessarily have to aspire to, and to, in fact, and I would say that to say that it is a virtue it's a matter of perspective, and maybe even a Western perspective on this thing. You know, being efficient, being well governed, being honest, these are more, you know, but you know, things that are important. I think if you're Chinese, transparent, it's debatable. So that, yeah.
So just a
I
quick
think when you talk about China, you have to be patient. You have to be patient. I think China has its all mapped out. When Communist Party is 100 years, they know exactly what would be the income, and 50 years from now, you know, how the society environment. So you just have to be patient and wait until it unfolds slowly. I think one of the most amazing thing about China is that since the full modernization for 3 decades, China have moved so fast that even the Chinese could not figure it out, you know, why it's happening. So to really support this quick rise, China have not yet really prepared all the necessary ingredient that will make China a modern state that is like in the West. The reason why I ask you whether China is a developed country or developing country is all the different. If you're a developing country, you follow rules like Thailand. And if you're a developed country, well, just like some of the Europe country and Japan, China and United States, they straight rule of laws, they make rules. Now China is in between, and AIIB could be one of the platform, maybe the ladder that China could climb slowly, I think, in the near future.
Yeah, thank you. Before I have Mark just give a quick answer, I just want to mention that, the dilemma for China is that it has benefited from the established rules from World War II, probably as much as any country. So for it to supplant these rules would really be something to see. Maybe it would just complement them, but it has been a major beneficiary of the rules and institutions over the last 70 years. Mark, from your study, can we say that transparency in some contexts can be exaggerated?
I'm not sure about that, but I would say in terms of the question how long it will take China to become transparent, I think it's a question that's very difficult or impossible to answer. But I think the important point that was already mentioned by the panel is this issue of Chinese pragmatism. I think the AIIB is a good example of that. They put Jin Lichun in charge. He's got an English literature degree. He's very personable. He knows how to engage with people from various different backgrounds. He fit in very well in the ADB and other international finance institutions. The bank is adopting some of the traits of other IFIs, including transparency, including publishing documentation accountability mechanisms and publishing documents that the policy banks would never dream of publishing. And I think both will happen. I think there will be a dual track. You'll have the AIB type model, which is more transparent, more inclusive, more integrated into global system, but then you'll still have the policy banks that are investing in often sensitive projects, maybe politicized projects, even prestige projects like stadiums and political buildings in developing countries and things like that. So I don't think we'll see a drastic change, rather maybe an additional kind of track for Chinese finance.
Thank you. Robert Kinnear, Alternative Innovations. Just to point that One Belt, One Road was actually a general concept of the UN, perhaps at least 10 years ago, when they were showing they were going to link Singapore to Moscow with various branches. So it's not really a Chinese original concept, perhaps. They've merely picked up on a UN concept that was there already. How their foreign policy works, a couple of means of demonstrating it. I was at an oil show a few years ago, and I met a Nigerian, asked where he was from. He said, oh, some small town he would never have heard of. And I said, well, I know something about your town. And he looked surprised, and I said, you've got a Chinese restaurant there, haven't you? And he looked at me wide-eyed, how did you know that? Well, this is how they work. I also went to live now living in summertime in a little town called Benicarlo in Spain, which has 5 China shops that sell everything you could possibly want for less than $1. All these places, they start out, this is how you get your knowledge and experience. It's relevant. These guys, they work in very menial little jobs, but their children, they become lawyers, become doctors, become professionals. The feedback to mainland China is enormous. This is happening globally.
Oh.
And where you come
Hello
from?
everyone, my name is Fu Hongli and I'm from Grand Innovation Hub, one of the Chinese local environmental organizations.
Thank you.
And I just have a few questions to Miss Luz and also Mr. James. First, to Miss Luz, first of all, I agree that China is trying to make some rules, but it's kind of follows. I think it kind of follows the framework of made by ADB or World Bank. So I would like to ask Ms. Lutz, does ADB or World Bank's safeguards, like safeguard system, work well that AIB can follow the framework?
As of now, both the World Bank and the ADB have their safeguards policies in place. So there are very critical areas wherein they identify already there, or they include like something on labor, on indigenous people, resettlement, environmental issues and all those stuff. So I think that's also why for AIIB, it still remains to be a framework. Unlike for ADB and the World Bank, it's really a policy already. It's similar as well to the energy and as well as the AIIB's policy. It's an interim policy for AIIB. Unlike for ADB, they have this policy disclosure. They call it the disclosure policy already in place. So both the World Bank and the ADB have more or less established policies.
Also to Mr. James, I would like you to do more advertisement on your book. It's kind of China's banking transformation, right? So I just have a question about the transformation, the banking transformation. So when you are talking about the transformation of the Chinese banking sector, is it a good transformation which meets the requirements of sustainable development goals and also Paris Agreement, which defines the related to 2 Celsius degree goals or something like that, or is it kind of transformation which might lead to some worse situation of banking sector or something like that? So I would like to raise this question.
Thank you very much. We'll take that as the last question for Jim Stent. Jim, perhaps you can address the question and also by way of telling us a little bit about the book in 1 minute.
I was going to say, the short answer to your question is buy my book. The book is about all of that. But basically, the decision was reached at the top levels of the Communist Party in the late 1990s that China could not achieve its economic development goals unless it put in place a professional, efficient, and well-run banking system. And they had on their hands a total mess that had approximately 40% NPLs. In the next 15 years or so, they transformed every aspect of the commercial banking system, at least for the top level banks. They're still working on the smaller local provincial ones. And to do that, they brought in basically Western best international banking practice. But they then grafted that onto Chinese cultural ideas about how an organization should work. And they also made sure that the banks serve not just the shareholders, but also the nation, 国家, that it should contribute to the development of the country. And lastly, they put the Communist Party in a very strong guidance role in the banks. The details of that are in my book.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've learned a lot today. We started with Mark Grimsditch's comprehensive, incisive report. Thanks very much for that, and to Louis for your comments on making the trip from the Philippines, from Manila, and then Assistant Joe Horn Phathanothai, Jim Stent, Kawit from Taiwan. Please join me in thanking all the speakers and presenters.